Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, November 7th, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. This week, Prime Minister Mark Carney shared Budget 2025, a budget that Carney says is to build Canada strong. The budget emphasized the importance of investing over spending, but what does that really mean? Here to break it down is economist Jim Stanford and Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Take a listen.
I'm here with Jim Stanford, economist and director for the Center for Future Work. We're here today to talk about the 2025 federal budget, which dropped on Tuesday, November 4th. A lot of hype around this budget, probably the most anticipation I've seen for a federal budget, maybe since Justin Trudeau's first COVID budget or Stephen Harper's budget in response to the 2008 financial crisis. Now, with Carney's background in finance, obviously, being a former Bank of Canada governor, Bank of England governor, worked his entire adult life in finance, a lot of, like I said, anticipation for this budget. So, Jim, just to start us off, what were your initial thoughts?
Well, Nick, you're right that there was a lot of anticipation, and those are good analogies. Back to the COVID budget, the global financial crisis. Now we've got our Trump trade war budget. That's what this one is. So lots of expectations that the government would think big in terms of trying to protect Canada's economy against Trump's attacks, generate new jobs and incomes given the crisis that's happening in some of our export industries like steel and auto and forestry, and kind of show a path forward for how Canada is going to pivot away from the United States and hopefully be a more sovereign, self-reliant country in the future. So those were the expectations, and frankly, the government overhyped them, using terms like transformative and generational and so on. In the end, it didn't quite meet those expectations. There are some things, some important things, some big things, even some positive things in this budget, but the scale of the ambition that is required to stand up to Trump is, I would say, lacking. For example, Mr. Carney called this an investment budget, and he had, kind of various funny phrases like spend less, invest more. So there is some investment in this budget, but not enough to meet the needs of the moment, for sure. So, and in this regard, it's a mixed bag. Like every budget, it's shaped by the political constraints of the moment that the government is in. There's things to like and things to hate about this budget. That sums it up.
On the Center for Future Work website, you had a really great analysis piece of this budget where you talk a little bit more about this distinction that the Carney government makes in the budget between spending and investing. Can you talk a little bit more about how they make that distinction in economic terms? Because it's a bit unusual from what previous governments have done.
Yeah, I think there's a huge dose of sort of narrative and symbolism in that distinction between spending and investing. Because, of course, when you invest, you still have to spend. And there's many types of spending that could be considered an investment. So the line between the two is extremely fuzzy and open to lots of interpretation. Now, as a progressive economist, I'm big on investment. I think we should invest more. And I'm sympathetic to the idea that the government has to invest. And I'm also sympathetic to the idea that spending on investments should be treated differently than the spending on current programs and services. In the same way that a business, for example, Nick, takes out a loan to invest in a factory or some new equipment or developing new software. It borrows money to finance that investment, and it isn't seen as profligate, or irresponsible to borrow money to pay for an investment because, number one, when you make that investment, you've got an asset that lasts, And number two, that asset presumably is contributing to the productive capacity of the firm and will allow it to pay for the interest on the borrowing, but also generate profit. That's why companies borrow. Companies don't follow any kind of weird rhetoric that says we must eliminate debt as our number one priority. Any CEO who stood up and said that would get voted out of office by the shareholders at the very next general meeting. Same goes for households. Think about households borrowing to pay for something that can be considered an investment, like a home, obviously, or a university education, or a car. If we didn't borrow to pay for those things, the economy would stop in its tracks. And exactly the same logic applies to government, but it's often been lost amidst all the anti-deficit rhetoric that's out there. So the general idea of thinking about investment as a priority, first of all, and treating it differently in your accounting and your budgets is absolutely legitimate. But I don't think this budget really delivered it. First of all, the basic budget numbers were all presented in a very conventional way, which is called accrual accounting. Accrual meaning that they take a little bit of account of capital investments in their basic budget framework, but just to the extent that existing capital has worn out or depreciated. So there's a little bit of treatment of capital in there, but the actual expenses on new capital investment aren't really broken out in that budget. And that's different than other jurisdictions. There are many provinces in Canada and many municipalities which break out a capital budget and an operating budget explicitly as two separate parts of the budget. And I thought the federal government might do that, but they didn't. What they did instead was they had an appendix to the budget that they said explained their so-called capital budgeting framework. And again, this is all about optics, not about the actual numbers. And they just took a big grab bag of different things, different categories of spending, and even different categories of tax cuts or tax breaks. They even counted what's called tax expenditures in this capital budgeting framework, like an incentive to encourage private companies to invest more in capital. We could have a debate about whether that makes sense or not. In many cases, it does. But you certainly can't call it the government making an investment. What you're doing is it's the government dangling a carrot in front of private firms to try to get them to make an investment. But they lumped all that into their capital budgeting framework at the end of the budget in this appendix, and then said, this is how much we're increasing investment. There's one kind of trick, optical trick that they tried with this, which is they added up the amount in these so-called investments, including things that aren't really investments, and then they compared it to the overall deficit on the budget. And by 2029, 2030, so 4 years out, the amount of investment exceeds the size of the deficit. And that is the basis for their claim that they will balance the operations end of the government by 2029, 2030, because they'll still have a deficit in the order of $50 billion, but that's smaller than the amount that they're spending directly and indirectly on these different investment-related initiatives. Therefore, they say, we've balanced the operating budget, all the rest is investment. And that's kind of an effort by the government to, appease critics of their deficit. I'm not worried about the deficit, so they didn't have to do that with me. But they are trying to appeal to, Bay Street and the financiers and probably some conservatives that they're still trying to get to cross the aisle and say, look, we're fiscally prudent even though we have big deficits. It's all about investment now. So that's where, in the end, I came away thinking there's a legitimate case to be made for more investment from government, absolutely. But I don't think they quite met the challenge of the moment in this regard.
That's interesting what you said about investment versus the deficit and how the government presented that, because for a household or for an individual who say has debt, if they turned around to their bank and said, well, yeah, I have X amount of thousands of dollars of debt, but say $10,000, but I spent $20,000 in investment this year, the government might say you have a cash flow issue, or the bank.
Right. Yeah, it is. I think mostly about optics and spin more than economic reality. Now, the bank will look at you if you go to them and say, I want to make an investment in a house. They're going to look at it and say, how are you going to pay back the interest and ultimately the principal on that? So they do still check. Just calling it an investment doesn't let you off the hook. And that will be the case even with Bay Street. The government borrows a lot of money from private banks and financial investors through their bonds and so on. And they are going to be looking at the government and saying, well, okay, I don't care what you call it. You still have to pay me back at the end of the day. Do you have the capacity to do so? And there's no doubt the government has the capacity to do so. And Bay Street knows it. Canada's deficit is small compared to other countries. And for all the dire predictions from Pierre Poilievre and others about, the government going bankrupt and so on, the financial industry knows that's false. And the financial industry knows that it's actually a good investment for them to buy these government bonds. So there's been no reaction at all from the financial community about the deficit in this budget. In fact, people are looking at Canada and saying, how did you keep your deficit so small? Look at the deficit in America. It's proportionately 3 times as big relative to the size of the economy as Canada's is. So there is no concern out there about the deficit. And the government didn't really have to jump through these optical hoops in order to justify its deficit, but it kind of fits. It's on brand with Mr. Carney, to look like he's a real mover and shaker in the financial world. He's not just running a deficit, he's making investments. And if that helps the government's polling numbers, then then I guess they'll consider it a success.
Now, there was a lot of anxiety, I would say, from unions, particularly unions that represent federal workers, that there would be significant austerity measures in this budget. Is that something that you saw in what the government wound up tabling, is a lot of cuts?
Well, there certainly is austerity in some places in the budget, and this again fits with the government's narrative about spending less and investing more. In particular, direct federal civil service payrolls are projected to fall by 40,000 positions over the next 4 years, which is a reduction of around 10%. So that is a significant reduction in overall employment. The federal civil service has grown rapidly in recent years, and for good reason. There's lots of tasks, and people still complain that they can't get their passports in time and can't get someone on the phone at CRA and so on. So I reject the idea that we had to have these cutbacks in order to pay for the investments on the other side of the ledger. That's false, particularly at a moment when the government also had significant tax cuts in their overall framework. So, since the election, the government has abandoned the capital gains reforms that were going to generate several billion a year. They've abandoned the digital services tax that was going to generate several billion a year. They've abandoned most of the counter tariffs on U.S. imports that were generating billions a year. And they've implemented this so-called middle class tax cut, which is a reduction in the lowest personal income tax rate from 15% to 14%. It's not really a middle class tax cut, but it is a tax cut, and that's worth, I think, about $5 or $6 billion a year. So put all those things together, you could even keep the middle class tax cut if you want as a bone, but the other 3 you absolutely could pay for all of the headcount reductions that are happening at the civil service. So I think that pain is not necessary fiscally. It will be significant in terms of the harm done to civil servants. Now, they say it's going to be through attrition, not through actual layoffs, but you still have a lower employment at the end of the day at a moment when Canada's unemployment is rising. So, we're supposed to be fighting a recession, not adding to it. In that regard, this is all quite misguided. Now, that being said, this is one area of the federal government's spending. The overall spending envelope is growing, not shrinking. So I think while critiquing the mean-spiritedness and unnecessariness and harm of those cutbacks in the civil service, it's not accurate to say this is an austerity budget. Spending is still growing. The deficit is growing. Combined with these investment measures, it will be a mildly stimulative budget. It will help a little bit in the big picture. But again, we need to be very harsh in our criticism of some of those cuts. I think that we're largely motivated, frankly, again, by optics. Carney wanted to, paint himself as a centrist, a fiscally prudent person, and so on. So even though his budget is spending more and the deficit is growing, he's going to stand up and say, I'm very, very tough on spending. And that's mostly about politics, not economics.
In a piece we published on Rabble from our parliamentary reporter, Carl Nirenberg, Carl's main takeaway was the significant amount of spending that went into the military budget. He almost termed it as a shift towards a war footing economy, and the increase in spending, which was quite drastic. I was just, what were your thoughts on that? Is that part of the government strategy to stimulate the economy, or is this again more optics around Trump and NATO and things like that?
Yeah, I think there's a stimulative dimension to it, for sure. And again, the fact that they're cutting the civil service but increasing military spending. And by the way, they're increasing military spending by more than they're cutting the civil service. So the net spending grows. This is what I was saying. But we can critique the government for spending too much on the wrong things and not enough on the right things. And this is a very clear contrast. Why is the government boosting the military spending? Well, partly they want to look tough with Trump and position Canada to play a bigger role in NATO, which has a very uncertain future given Trump. And there are also industrial and economic motivations for it. The government is going to be very ambitious at trying to make sure there's strong Canadian content in that military spending. There's all kinds of Canadian industries, including aerospace, obviously space, telecommunications and digital technology, shipbuilding, motor vehicles, and so on, that could all get a piece of all of this new military spending action. So there certainly will be some economic and industrial benefits from it, and some Canadian industries are very well positioned to be part of it. But again, that being said, I mean, if we're going to spend on the military, we better make sure we're buying Canadian-made stuff. But there's a deeper question, which is, why aren't we spending more on things that are obviously more relevant to day-to-day living standards, like renewable energy and affordable housing and community infrastructure?
And I'm glad you brought up affordability, because it leads into my next question about inflation. We did see inflation bump up a little bit from August to September, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on how this budget might affect rising inflation. I'm sure many listeners can remember in recent years, the higher inflation rates from 2 or 3 years ago, and just seeing inflation bump by about 0.5% from August to September raises the question, was that on the government's mind in this budget?
Yeah, well, first of all, Nick, in terms of that bump in inflation, it's nothing. It is absolutely nothing. It's a statistical mirage that resulted from the fact that gasoline prices fell very steeply 12 months earlier. So the year-over-year inflation rate that compared October's number, actually this was September's number to the previous September, was artificially higher because the previous September's number was artificially lower. So there is no bump in inflation. That's not happening. And if anything, because of the weakness in the economy, the underlying inflation is probably a bit below the 2% target that the Bank of Canada follows. So there's no looming inflation threat. And we have to be careful with this line of argument, because this is going to be Pierre Poilievre's main attack on the government, is that the deficit is too big and it's going to cause inflation, and it does nothing for so-called affordability. And his link between the deficit and inflation is utterly false. It wasn't the deficit that caused inflation. It was other things in the aftermath of COVID, particularly price gouging by companies in very strategic industries like energy, housing, and food, who took advantage of the disruption and shortages at that moment. That's all water under the bridge now. Inflation is back to its normal level. And in fact, wages in Canada have recovered. Real wages are higher now on average than they were before the pandemic, thanks to higher minimum wages and a lot of strikes by trade unions and others. So this affordability issue is tricky, and we have to be careful we don't fall into a right-wing frame that the reason that cost of living feels high is because of government taxes and unions and regulations and red tape and so on. Now, that being said, for sure, we have to do more to try and address the cost of basic necessities, housing first and foremost, but other things the government can do in other areas. The biggest issue in affordability is trying to keep the economy going and the labor market strong. And in this regard, the best affordability strategy is one that puts Canadians to work so they have income to pay for those things. And in that regard, even though the budget didn't have direct affordability initiatives in it, to give everybody, $500 in a low-income tax credit or something like that, the impact on investment, growth, and job creation will be the ultimate determinants of whether affordability gets better or worse in the months ahead.
And I'm really glad you brought up those conservative talking points. You've had some really great articles that we published on Rabble and, of course, on centerforfuturework.ca, really unpacking those. And for any listeners who want to learn some more, I suggest reading up on those great articles on our websites. And now for my last question, Jim, just for you, what would you have liked to have seen from this budget? What could the Carney government have done to meet the moment?
I think that given the kind of existential challenge that we've been talking about, and even Mr. Carney was talking about, in the election, but even since the election, that this is a moment where Canada's future as a sovereign, fully capable industrial economy is going to be decided. I think we needed a wartime budget, not war in the sense of even more military spending. There's lots of that in this budget, but wartime budget in the sense of mobilizing every lever that government can to support this national mission. And this national mission is going to be all about building our economy so that it's more self-reliant and less vulnerable to Trump's erratic attacks. And that does mean more investment in everything like transportation and high-speed rail and east-west-north electricity grids and renewable energy. It also means supporting industries, the value-added industries that we need, instead of saying, well, all we need to do is sell oil to China instead of America, and then we'll be fine. That's not going to solve our problem at all. What we need to do is build the industries that add value to our resources rather than just digging them out of the ground and selling them to someone else. And we need to invest in our people. And this is where the artificial contradiction between spending and investing, or spending on current programs and services like healthcare and education versus investing in big projects, that dichotomy is false. We need both of those things, and investing more in the non-traded economy and the care economy creates jobs and incomes right now. It supports Canadians to do their best in this new self-reliant economy in the future, and it builds the sort of social cohesion that we're going to need in order to stay unified in the face of Trump. So in all those ways, I think the budget was underwhelming. And this is a moment when we needed more ambition. And that for me, is the fundamental critique of this budget.
Very well said. Jim, thanks so much for giving us your analysis. We really value your insights and taking the time to speak with me today.
It's a pleasure, Nick, and thank you and the whole team at Rabble for the wonderful work that you do. We need Rabble and its voice more than ever these days.
Thank you very much, Jim.
That was economist Jim Stanford alongside Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Thanks so much for that, Nick and Jim. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. To do that, let's turn things back over to Nick Seabrook. Back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. Starting this week with national news. As discussed in our interview, Mark Carney's Liberal government tabled its 2025 federal budget on Tuesday. Rabble's parliamentary reporter Carl Nirenberg noted that the budget saw big increases in military spending, while cutting almost everywhere else. The federal government will be spending an increase of nearly $16 billion per year for 5 years on the military. The budget creates a brand new Defense Investment Agency, which the federal government says is designed to reduce Canada's reliance on the U.S. for procurement of military technology and equipment. The government, however, is continuing to buy the U.S.-made military products like the F-35 jet, and will continue to participate in joint military ventures like the North American Aerospace Defense Command, also known as NORAD. Militaries around the world are one of the chief producers of harmful carbon emissions that worsen the climate crisis. While Canada will be increasing its spending on its military, there are few investments going to address climate change. Labour unions also weighed in on the federal budget. Unions like the Public Service Alliance of Canada and the Canadian Labour Congress were critical of the government's budget, which seeks to cut 40,000 federal jobs over the next 4 years. Public Service Alliance of Canada President Sharon D'Souza said that these cuts would weaken public services that people rely on, saying, quote, "People can expect longer wait times for passports, EI, and childcare benefits. more unanswered calls at Canada Revenue Agency, reduced public health and food safety efforts, and a government that isn't there for ordinary people when they need it most, end quote. The Canadian Union of Public Employees likewise criticized the budget, noting the Liberal government was prioritizing investing in public dollars into the private sector while at the same time reducing public programs. In other labor news, healthcare workers represented by the Alberta Union of Public Employees have voted 98% in favor of a strike if their current negotiations with the government don't reach an acceptable settlement. Union President Sandra Azokar said that her union will remain at the negotiating table until the end of the weekend at least, but that she could give the government a 72-hour strike notice as soon as November 17th. Azokar said that the union and the government remained far apart on issues such as wages. The Alberta government recently used the notwithstanding clause in the Canadian Constitution to force Alberta teachers back to work. Alberta teachers had been striking throughout most of October in the longest and largest strike of its kind in the province's history. The use of the notwithstanding clause by the government to end the strike was criticized by the Alberta Federation of Labour because they say it violated a worker's right to negotiate with their employer. The Alberta Federation of Labour has already threatened a general strike to support teachers, and if the government uses the notwithstanding clause again in its current negotiations with healthcare workers, that could push the province even closer to a historic general strike. In environmental news, the annual Conference of the Parties, or COP Climate Change Summit, will be taking place in Brazil next week. This is the 30th annual COP meeting, and in a column on Rabble, Dave Suzuki writes that for years now, the event has been undermined by pro-fossil fuel lobbyists. Whether it be by oil-producing nations like Saudi Arabia or fossil fuel corporations like Exxon, Suzuki says that progress at these conferences has been intentionally stalled over the years. According to Suzuki, corporate influence needs to be excluded from important climate summits like COP if they are ever to produce tangible response to climate change. And as always, you can read about all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thank you as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Nirenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.